I'll just let you know that once Dima starts presenting, I'll just make sure everybody is muted and the video is off. But Verena can go over sort of how we will run this final seminar. For most of us, it's the first time we're doing it via Zoom, so we'll just have to see how it goes. So, and I will hand it over to Verena.
Thank you, Deb. Thank you everyone for joining. It's very excited for Dima to get to this point, and we're excited to hear what you have to present. So Dima's topic is Refugee Architecture, a socio-spatial reading of planned humanitarian settlements in Jordan. So her principal supervisor is Deb Cushing, and also here is her associate supervisor, Anoma Kumara Surya, and I believe Laurie Byers was previously your principal supervisor. So welcome all, and panel member is Janice Riga, and I'm here as the panel chair and panel member. So just a few notes how we're going to run this. So this is really an opportunity for Dima to well, present her work before it goes for examination, and for us to give feedback, and for everyone here in the virtual room to ask questions and give feedback as well to Dima. So she's submitted a written document as well 2 weeks before the seminar, which the panel has read. So we'll provide feedback on that later. You'll present for 45 minutes, right, Dima? Mm-hmm. And I will, you'll share your screen, and I'll give you a 5-minute notice via chat room before the 45 minutes run out. So we're trying to stick to time. After the presentation, we're opening up for questions. So I would like anyone who has a question or feedback, if you could please let me know via chat, either directly privately to me or to everyone, so we can coordinate who goes first and how we asking the questions. Again, this is really an opportunity to support Dima and with her work. So we want to hear constructive feedback, and yeah, do think about your questions while she's presenting in terms of supporting her with finalizing her thesis for examination. And then once that's done, I think everyone except panel and supervisors will leave, including Dima. And then we will have a brief discussion and call you back in to the meeting to give you your full feedback. So at this point, are there any questions or everything is clear?
All clear.
Great. And again, if there is anything, as Deb said, this is our first time. If there's anything that people want to suggest or something is not working for them, do just send me a message via chat. And we're asking not for people to write chat messages to Dima while she's presenting. All right. Great. Shall we start?
Sure.
Okay, setting the timer. Over to you, Dima.
Okay. Start by the research, Refugee Architecture, a socio-spatial reading of planned humanitarian settlements in Jordan. But before introducing my topic, I would like to take you quickly through the structure of the research and the presentation. First of all, I'm going to introduce the topic, the theoretical problem, and the research question. And then we'll go through literature review, which will position the question in the theoretical debates, and then methodology, research design, and my empirical chapters or papers, contribution, which show the findings of the research, and then the conclusion. So start with the introduction. Most of us are familiar with refugee settlements, or also known as refugee camps. And this is a very common photo that we see in the media, especially with UN funding campaigns. And refugee camps are designed by humanitarian organizations as temporary standardized infrastructures that respond to moments of political failure that result in mass displacement. So what I mean by standardized infrastructures or temporary standardized infrastructure is something like this. A shelter design catalog in the UN offers this solution for sheltering a family. And we can see it on the border of Colombia for Venezuelan refugees, Bangladesh, Jordan. And that was 3 years after the establishment of that camp. However, when I visited that camp, it looked something like this, which means the ephemeral solution transforms over time in a state of temporary, as refugees suffer from something called a protracted situation, which means a very, very, very long stay in refugee camps. And this transformation results in a very complex urban entity or refugee settlement. So in Jordan, there are around 700,000 Syrian refugees and over 2 million refugees of Palestine. And there are 3 main moments that resulted in refugee camps in Jordan. First one is the Nakba in 1948, and refugee camps look like this, and today they look like that. And the second moment is the 1967 Six-Day War. Refugee camps started like this, and today they look like that. And of course, the latest Syrian crisis in 2011, refugee camps started like this, and today they look like that. Although refugee camps have been previously discussed in the fields of social science, geopolitics, philosophy, Agamben, Agir, Malki, Bowman, Sanya, all of these theorists discussed refugee camps. However, it remains unexplored territory in the field of architecture, which I'm focusing on and discussing on today. So my research was to discuss the space of refugee camps, the built environment of refugee camps. However, it was done through phenomenological approach to build episodic yet holistic overview of refugee architecture. So to frame the research problem better, I would like to take you through some terms. First of all, the refugee, the subject of the refugee settlement. Every 2 seconds, a person is displaced due to a conflict or persecution, and there are a total of 26 million refugees in the world right now. 20 million of them are under the UNHCR mandate. So who's a refugee is someone who's unable to go back to their home country of nationality or scared to go back, according to the 1951 Refugee Convention. The camp is a long-lasting island of temporary dwellings. They are ruled by the humanitarian bodies under the mandate of humanity, impartiality, neutrality, and independence. To understand the specialities of camps from refugee-centered perspective, I considered architecture or understanding a space from a social perspective, beyond geography or the physical materiality. Architecture is the contained social space and its interrelationships within the building that portrays societies and their practices. Buildings are social objects. They're not the surfaces, they're what's inside them and the syntax of the social spaces inside. So architecture in refugee camps is the growing spatial needs that arise in the state of perpetual waiting that allows the transformation of these temporary humanitarian infrastructures into complex urban bodies. These spaces, it looks messy on the surface and it challenges our understanding of the architectural form. And so this boils down to the question, how do displaced communities inside humanitarian planned settlements in Jordan create and also experience architecture? And why would I care? The significance of this research, of the research question. we care because right now it's timely and there is a heightened sense of urgency, given that the world is witnessing this huge, unprecedented, growing amount of refugee communities living in refugee camps. And that's the primary focus and significance, is the people, and having an empirical data from the inside that goes beyond the normal news reports or the UN reports or funding campaigns. So to go through literature review, usually in presentation, I get bored looking at bullet points and people reading their literature review. So for this literature review, let's just try and visualize each thematic, because my literature review is a thematic anthology, each theme as a shape. So what shape is a refugee camp in terms of space? So to discuss the first conceived solution and basically the epistemological construction of a refugee camp and the reason it's temporary, it's good to go back to the origin of refugee camps. And it started in post-World War II Europe, when refugee management solutions became standardized and globalized and under the humanitarian mandate. However, before that, it used to be a military solution for a combat problem of refugees. So the genesis of refugee camp came from the military barrack, and that's why also it's temporary. So even in Roman military camps, it's orthogonal in organization, built around central utility buildings, and featured intersecting roads with temporary shelters in between. And we can see that today in the modern refugee camps. Also, another thing is that I need to highlight is that the temporary protection as a concept for refugee camp, it's not defined in the UNHCR Refugee Convention. It's unregulated practice of temporary protection that happens between the hosting governments and the humanitarian bodies. However, the protracted situations, which means the very, very, very long stay of refugees in a temporary setting, it's unresolved. So what we know today, that there are 78% of refugees in protracted situations, and we can't know when would it end. So World Bank reported that there are refugees that stay from 37 years up to 17 years in protraction. However, Palestinian refugees stayed in their camps since 1948. So what results is this. What seems on the surface very chaotic and messy built environment. It's also called building transgressions, spatial violations to the humanitarian organization's design. Quickly as well, we go to the second theme, which is the exclusion and inclusion of refugees in a state of exception. So Agamben basically theorizes and conceptualizes the refugee space in a state of exceptions on the threshold of the law and politics of the state, on the edge of sovereignty. We can't understand it from inside the state because it's positions outside in a state of exception. However, it's important to maintain the state's sovereignty. And then in a series of exchanges between Michel Legier, Malky, and Bowman, there was another reading for the camp space from an anthropological perspective that basically states that the refugee camp is a city camp. It's incomplete city, and it's managed by global practice and culture of template by the humanitarian bodies. So the weakness in that part, which is very important to the research, the city camp, is that there was no city that Ajir compared his perception of city camp to. So how do you know it is a city or it's an incomplete city? And there are other theories that came in between the triangle and the circle, the Agamben state of exception, and the city camp of Algiers, which is campsmanship, refugee camp heritage, and campscapes. And campsmanship is from a sociology perspective. It basically signifies the political membership between the inhabitants of the camps. However, Hilal and Petty came and they're like, let's nominate the refugee camp as a heritage site and consider the camp as a space established for the intention to be demolished. And campscapes, which is a very interesting theory, it's about the new spatial model of analysis defined by its fluidity and how it's elastic. So in conclusion, I'd like to quote Nasser Abu Rahmeh saying that the camp appears a suspended ahistorical presence of exile, yet beneath the camp, the concrete political totality underpinning it, we don't know. The realities of the built environment, we don't know. And especially from my definition of architecture as a social product, also, this is an unexplored territory. So for me, at that point, the conception of a refugee camp is undefined. So how would we know? And here we're going to discuss the methodology and the research design. My way of knowing is through qualitative methodology for inquiry and a theoretical phenomenological framework to conceptualize refugee architecture. So basically, my field work was carried out in 3 refugee camps to collect qualitative observations and through a set of data collection tactics that were analyzed according to units of levels of perception. So my research sought to provide interpretations for the refugee settlements through observations of multiple levels of perception. So first of all, I'd like to go back to Norbert Scholz's definition of architecture, and it's basically relies on the man schemata that basically the perception of the space around a human experience and the building of that into a concrete space. So Norbert Scholz defined that further and defined the levels of perception. And in my research, I translated that into my 3 levels of perception: the domestic shelter and how shelters are organized together as a 2nd level of perception, and camp as one urban entity. So the research design involved the theoretical framework that relied on the levels of perception in 3 sites of camps, one from each locality time. So we had one from the 1948 Nakba refugee camps, another from the 6-day war refugee camps, and another from the Syrian crisis, to have a better understanding of the evolution of the urbanization in the camps. And so in Jordan, there are around 15 camps that are managed by the UNHCR from different age brackets. And I selected 3 camps to portray one of these and like cases, not cases, sites. Okay, so my 3 camps were Jabal Hussein camp that was built in 1951 and run by the UNRWA. The Jarash Gaza camp built in 1967, also run by the UNRWA. And then the Zatari camp built in 2012, run by UNHCR. And the way I collected data was simple, documenting my observations through photography. And I was very fortunate that I had a research assistant to help me for the 2 Palestinian camps. And it's part of the data collection tactics and documentation of the observations. And then shelter surveying, which meant sketching and literally measuring 60 shelters in the 3 camps and drawing it. And then guided walkthroughs, which gave me a very important idea about the urbanization of the camp. And it was so beneficial to collecting data. And then lots of field notes and sketches, and also desk research that included going through UN reports and data sheets. So the first unit of analysis and the first contribution is the domestic refugee architecture in Jordan, which is the smallest unit, the first part of the empirical findings. And it basically establishes the transformation of the evolution of the reappropriated refugee dwellings in the protracted scenarios in Jordan. So we interrogated the relationship between the traditional spatial practices present in the region, especially in the vernacular architecture, and what we call domestic refugee architecture. To unpack that, we're going to go through the start of the refugee camps, and then the morphology from the tent, and then the refugee architecture and its elements. So in the case of refugee camps, the humanitarian organizations take over the design process. So usually in any architecture project, there is the program, the list of needs, and how it fits through studying the geography. And that's the first start of designing space. However, in the case of refugee camps, the humanitarian organizations take over the role of the architect, and they solve the spatial problem, and they create the space. So the early UNRWA shelters started by tents, and also there was this struggle between the refugees and the humanitarian sector. Do we want it to be permanent? We're going to go back to our homes. However, with the first snowstorms and the need for refugees to have protection, they started building boulder walls, or as we call them in Arabic, sanasil, a common practice for the fruit gardens in Palestine, especially that it's on a hill. So refugees started building, you can see that in the second photo, started evolving their solution and dividing their tents using the UN blankets. And also the UNRWA supported that by providing self-help approach, where they provided materials for building or grants. However, what happened was something that started to look messy on the surface. Zinco, which is the corrugated metal roofs, and an explosion of building blocks. And this is, for example, an example in Jebel Hussein camp of one shelter that you can see has all the elements of the self-help approach. And then in 1956, there was the hut camp layout, which was an in-between solution where refugees were provided asbestos shelters with corrugated metal roofing. And it's basically one-room units, but it also follows the genesis of the military orthogonal organization of the overall camp master plan. This solution is still used up until today, and we see caravans in Zatari camp. So the morphology started with the empty land and each family were assigned a numero or a plane or an area that they can't exceed. And then each family lived on that, whether started with a tent, emergency tent, and how it evolved to the current structure. So when we define architecture, especially for early students, we always come up with these romantic notions about architecture. It's frozen music. The architect assumes the aesthetic value and the creator and the composer of the space. However, I'm going to reiterate the need to look at this from social syntax point of view, and that buildings are the containers of a social activity that is commanded by a social syntax. You don't enter a house through the bathroom. This is the simplest example. And the way the spaces are organized can give us an idea about the architecture of that space beyond the messy surface. So surveying 60 shelters, to sum it up, there were patterns that kept repeating and spatial components or elements that they kept repeating in a certain order that can tell us more about the syntax of the refugee architecture. And the first one is the numero. And this is an imposed invisible line that the humanitarian body demarcates the tenured camp land and allows each family to occupy a house plot, a household plot. And it became the legal marker for the camp geography. So even though families grow, they are still only allowed to occupy this particular land plot. And we see it even with the morphology. They can never cross these plots. Another element is the sitara, and sitara in Arabic means curtain or drapery. However, it's a term used for the in-between space between the absolute public, the outside space, and the house door. And it's for privacy, and it's something that is present in traditional architecture in the region. You wouldn't find a door that opens immediately to the outside public. There is always an in-between space. In the less dense camps, such as Gaza camp, you'd find it inverted. It starts from the door, but families add a little area of privacy. And also it's seen in the newest Zaatari camp as well. Another element is the haush, which is the central courtyard of the house. Also another element that is present in the traditional architecture in the region. And also it's where all the family carries out their day-to-day activities in the house, and in evenings at night it's used to host. We see it in the less dense camp as semi-covered and sometimes completely left open. In Zaatari, there is a similar space used for the same purpose. However, it's covered. And I'd like to remind everyone that Zaatari is in the middle of the eastern desert. It's a very harsh weather there. And the third element is the hammam, or the space of the bathroom. And usually in refugee settlement, it's a communal service, communal utility service. However, in this case, it transitioned to the inside of the dwelling. I would like to highlight that in the Palestinian camps over the time, the infrastructure to allow the master plan. However, in Zaatari, it still hasn't happened. Okay. There is some noise. I don't know. Sorry. So in the Zaatari, families started digging their own septic tank. And in 2017, we know that there are 4,000 private toilets that do not comply to the minimum hygiene standards. So what we know about domestic refugee architecture is that displaced community, even though they are they have disposition from the geography and the physical connection to their homelands. However, they carry the space syntax and the way they use the house and the spatial practices for creating the spaces, even in a vacuum of a refugee camp. The second unit of analysis, which is the relationship of the shelters to each other. It's the neighborhood, basically. And there I discussed it on a tangible and intangible levels. Intangible is the toponyms or the place names that identify a point in geography within the borders of the state sovereignty. However, in a refugee camp, place names or toponymic inscriptions are not present. You wouldn't find street names and numbers. You would find codes. And because the refugee camps are outside the sovereignty of the state, outside the state of exception, they are usually gray blobs on maps, on official maps. So what does it say to have a name or a place name? It's usually a symbolic production of the urban space and also a symbol for the exercise of power and the ideological dominance over a space. So by understanding how shelters are named and the reference, the geographic reference in a state, in a non-place, in a state of exception, we can have a better understanding of the power relationships in a camp. So in a camp, there are two actors. There is the refugee community and the employee of the UN or the humanitarian organization. And usually there are certain forms of logistical knowledge and the culture of templates that applies in any camp, anywhere around the world, regardless of the culture. So in refugee camps, there is an organization for the address codes. It starts with a shelter, and then every 16 shelters, there's a community. Every 16 community, there's a block. 4 blocks, a sector, and a camp is made of 4 sectors. So the shelter codes and address system assert a separation between the two actors when the humanitarian employee or the humanitarian worker applies this code on a shelter without thinking of the other actor. So if you go around Zatari, which is the most recent, you would find the shelter codes sprayed on every caravan. However, if we go back to the earliest camp, we would see a more primitive humanitarian code. And this, the Jabal Hussein camp was established literally 1 year after the UN Refugee Convention. So it shows an earlier attempt to organize the space. And in Jabal Hussein, if you see on the map, it's sliced to 49 slices, and the slices are just numbered. And because of the geography is sloped, you would see that there is a lower section and an upper section of each slice, as you see in the photo. And this is a map of the camp where there are no names. You're completely lost. And refugees resolve to basically, if they have any ad, and this is a picture, if you can see on the pole, there is an ad for a room for rent, but it's somewhere on 31st Upper. We don't know where it is, but you can call and one of the refugee community will come and guide you. In Gaza camp, there was a different kind of organization, which is based on the familial relationships. So as I went there for the fieldwork, I was completely disoriented and I didn't know where I am. And then I went to the DPA office and I saw a master plan for the camp that shows each section, each neighborhood named by the family. And that's how families basically make their area known. Okay, so when we go back to, going back to the Zaatari camp, which is the most iconic, it has around 80,000 refugees, you would see the expansion of it, and it has around 12 districts. And on the facades of the caravans, you would see the codes. However, NRC, they established another program called Shelter Graffiti, where they're like, each district can draw on the caravans and use it as empty canvases according to a certain theme that would have a distinction on the geography. Also, there were names, attempts of naming the streets, but it was weak attempts. You would find the street of the rose, the street of the roses, the street of the flower, and the street of the flowers. So what does these names tell us about the non-place is that the sovereignty and the governmentality of the humanitarian body, basically, it's one-sided and it acts on the refugees. So first of all, why there are no names? Simply because it's positioned in the non-place, in the state of exception. How? That the humanitarian body in a space of vacuum uses the codes and the code flows, and by that I'm citing Deleuze and Guattari's ontological interpretations of organizations as desiring machines, and the multiplicity is basically a performance of quote unquote flows. And why not? Refugees retaliated by showing their agency over the space and basically naming their own spaces, as we saw in Gaza camp by naming their neighborhoods by familiar names. The second actual analysis of the physical relationship between the different shelters, it's by exploring the elastic urban tissue. And quickly to summarize, it was done through understanding the relationship between the mass and the void, figure-ground relationships, and how shelters extend and create an elastic urban tissue. In Zaatari, the whole shelter changes places. In Jewish camp, it's introverted, and you would see the grid intact. However, in the older camps, it overspills and creates an overall elastic urban tissue. And the last contribution in the last unit of analysis is the refugee souk. And I use the souk, which is an Arabic name for traditional marketplaces, to indicate the overall complex urban body of the camp. So we're going to explore the camps from a humanitarian infrastructure to a city, the souk in different camps. And this is a top view of one section of the souk in Jabal Hussein. So the way I looked at this unit of analysis, just like an orange slice, when you see an orange slice, you're going to assume it comes from a whole fruit. The ontological construction of the orange slice goes beyond just a slice. And same goes with the refugee urban structures. When we look at the souk, we can tell that the overall urban body is a city camp. It is transforming into a complex urban body. And also, we can understand that there is a social production of space. And the souk is a representational space that hosts spatial practices. And also, we can assume that the genus loci, or loci, I don't know, that there is the spirit of in the city, the space holds an essence. It hosts where the social life and the encounter between the people and the physical structure. And the souk is a marker for us to know that. So in traditional Arab cities, the souk as a social space is a thoroughfare that hosts the performance of social rituals. And communal life and interactions. It's the focal point of any city, Arab city. So in Jabal al-Hussein, we see that the Ain Jalut Street, right in the middle of the camp, the long street, it hosts the main souk of the camp. And in that souk, we see that the souk crawls to the public space. You can see from the diagrams that even extends beyond the sidewalk. Also, we see that there is an element called basta, which means the rollout, where street vendors interact with the people in the streets. Also, another interesting thing I found while I was doing fieldwork, that there was a banner inviting people for a wedding that's positioned in Ain Jalut Street. Another souk is the Gaza camp, which is more recent and has less socializing. And also you would see the main thoroughfare in the middle, but also there's another souk pocket north, which means it's something like a bazaar. In the Gaza camp, you'd see that most socializing happens on the platforms, the thresholds of the shops. And it's elevated. There's always a courtesy chair for the old people in the camp to sit on. And this is a view of the camp that shows the structure of the pocket, the souk pocket. It's like a bazaar. It has overhangs and a diminished scale for people to socialize and interact. And in Zate, there are 4 main streets that has around 1,400 shops, serve everything from wedding dresses to food to, electronics and everything. And in the souk in Zatari, the most recent, you would find that the socializing happens inside the shop. It's very minimal. Shop owners abide by the social contract of the edges of the shops. And it's bright, it's well branded. The shop name, it takes a lot of weight on the facade. So we can see that in the older camps, where there are higher transformation to urbanity and city camps, the social space takes over the public space and it diminishes to the new camps. And in conclusion, how do displaced communities inside humanitarian planned settlement in Jordan create and experience architecture? We've explored that on a domestic shelter level, shelter organization, and camp as an urban entity. And the secret to tying all of this together is understanding concept of dia placement, which simply means that people, even though they're in displacement, they emplace themselves, they put down roots, they progress of inhabiting the place, even if it's a temporary speciality. So dia placement offers the idea of settlement. And refugee architecture is established when people settle, even if the settlement surface is temporary, such a refugee camp. So the humanitarian emergency starts with the establishment of a temporary humanitarian solution. However, it ends with the creation of refugee architecture that belongs to the community and created by the community. And I would like to end with the implications of this research. So refugee architecture is architecture, which we explored from a social meaning, from an as a phenomenal space, and that goes beyond the messy surface and the reality and materiality of it. And also this research offers a new narrative about refugee camp, an original empirical contribution that stems from the experience of the space. And also the camp is a space of agency. On a theoretical and academic level, we can understand that the narrative positioned refugees in its center And we can see that all these evolutions happen by the refugee community. And also the urban camp is a living urban tissue. Even as an urban entity, it does transform into a complex city. And yeah, thank you. Yeah, stop sharing.
It's like a silent clapping. Thank you so much, Dima, for the presentation. I'm seeing lots of claps here. Well done. It's a different kind of atmosphere here on Zoom. But thanks for sharing that. Thanks for talking us through all the findings of your research. It is fascinating research. I've just posted for people to let me know via chat for feedback and questions. And we open it up first for everyone, anyone who would like to comment, provide feedback, or have questions, anything that wasn't clear to people, or that they like further information on. Please let me know. You've got a good crowd here, so we've got 44 people. That is really wonderful.
Yeah.
Well done.
Went up to 46.
Okay, during the, yes,
yeah,
right.
Yeah, 43 to 46, fluctuating all the time.
Fantastic. That's really
I
great.
think that's remarkable.
And a lot of thumbs up. Fantastic.
Thank you.
I might start with a question if people are still thinking about their questions. So obviously your research, Dima, relied quite a bit on your own interpretation and your own positioning within that. Could you share a little bit more about your position and your background, perhaps as an architect, and more of a personal reflection? What did you learn? How did your thinking shift, and what are you taking away from it? And just interested in your own position on it, and your background before you started, and how this process has really influenced perhaps you, and how you brought that to your analysis as well.
Sure. Well, I'm an architect, half Jordanian, half Egyptian, but I grew up in Jordan. And Jordan is the focal point of basically the politics of the region, because it's the only safe country in a region that has many wars and conflicts around it, which resulted in Jordan hosting a lot of waves, even beyond the formal refugee camps. We have Iraqi refugees, Circassian, Sudanese. But my research was stemmed out of my curiosity as an architect who worked in conservation and heritage, to understand the mess. Because when you drive in Jordan, you definitely pass by few refugee camps just going from point A to point B. And it's the surface, the messy surface, that challenged my understanding of architecture and how is it created, and curiosity for sure. And also my understanding that from my knowledge of conservation heritage, that mess is not created as a mess. It doesn't happen just like that. It comes from people's taking with them their practices and trying to apply it by themselves, which questions the role of an architect as well. So, yeah. I hope I answered that question. I don't know.
Yes, right. And that then influences how architects should think about these spaces, I guess.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think you find that present in most of the chapters. There is always an alternative interpretation that always goes back to the culture and heritage and the social structure of that community.
Great. Thank you, Dima. Where are the questions? Is this okay? So we have a question from Alia, and please, I'll unmute yourself and you can ask the question overall.
Hello, I was just wondering for Dima, thank you, that was amazing. I was wondering like whether you think there are, what this means in terms of the original designs that the humanitarian organizations sort of base the camps on, whether you think that there should be changes made to those original designs, given that, you know, the research that you've done and that you've found that people are staying so long in the refugee camps.
Yes. I think one common thing that kept happening throughout the research is that the solution, again, it follows, any solution for mass displacement follows a culture of templates. This is a really scary place to start hosting refugee communities in. You can't just host any community on any geography the same way. I think what I really hope for this research to reveal that refugee communities don't have this muted identity. The poor victim in the distance that has no name or culture or you know, spatial needs and practices that are distinctive to that culture. So, however, mass displacements happen and the need for emergency solutions happen. And what I hope for is that whatever solution takes into account a level of elasticity and agency for the community to create their own spaces. Yeah, so I hope that answered your question as well.
Thank you for that. And we have another question from Liz. Liz, can you ask the question?
Sure. Hi, can you hear me?
Yeah.
Being cautious not to kind of romanticize what are very difficult circumstances for a lot of communities living in informal settlements, I'm curious what the points of resilience are that you think we could actually learn from when it comes to formal development and urban development of larger cities, and whether there are aspects or what the aspects are in informal settlements that could carry across to other contexts as points of learning.
Well, I'm very cautious to use the term informal settlement, and that's one thing I never used in my research, because I truly don't believe that refugee camps are informal settlements. On the surface, they do have a messy built environment. However, going back to the domestic architecture analysis, there is a very distinct order, and the order is revealed when looking at the elements that host the dwellings within its surfaces. I don't believe that there is something called absolute informality, and it's very distinct to each culture. So first of all, that's the first thing, the idea of informality. Refugee camps are organized, even though the surfaces, the container looks messy. That's one. Two, what can we learn? I think we can learn simply giving agency to people and positioning the architect in a place that can listen and can basically adopt the space syntax that each culture already has. That's something that can be applied to more formal designed spaces. I think it becomes a question, how does the architect see their work affecting the people, I think.
Thanks, Dima. That's a great answer. Appreciate it.
Excellent. No more questions so far?
I might ask one, Verena, if that's okay.
Dima, it's been an interesting journey, your PhD, and for a variety of reasons. And I guess I wouldn't mind just talking about your method at the moment. Your method is architecture, and with it you are not able to to anyone, or and photos are restricted. I guess I wouldn't mind you just commenting on, I guess, the impact that not being able to interact with participants or with people, and how you were sure that the way that you did your interpretation was robust and had validity. So maybe it's a question around, you had a lot of limitations, all research does. So how did you deal with that to make sure that the way that you approached your method allowed for, you know, a robustness of the results coming out?
First of all, I would like to highlight that formally I wasn't allowed to speak to refugees and include their voice unedited, not just because of the you know, education institution guidelines, ethical guidelines, the university, but also it was the UN guidelines, because of many researchers at that time, especially from humanities, would go, and sometimes it would abuse the vulnerable community. So there wasn't, I couldn't interview refugees, but I entered their houses, and the physical trace and the observation, especially for someone who can speak Arabic and understands the cultural undertones of the spoken or unspoken words. So yes, I didn't include the voice of a refugee, but I existed in a space where refugees existed, and I was invited inside their houses, and I measured it, and the physical trace and documenting the physical trace was sort of forensic architecture, like Il Wiseman says. It allowed me to understand the community.
Thanks, Laurie. More questions from perhaps Janice as panel member or the other supervisors?
Yes, I'm happy. I have a couple of questions and a couple of comments, Dima. Sure. Really, really excellent presentation. It was thoroughly enjoyable to read your PhD. So much so, as a side note, that I'm very happy to invite you to do a guest lecture on your PhD to our 500 spatial history students. I think it's very, very worthy of a conversation around refugee architecture and how it has its own kind of social spatial syntax. I really applaud you for your kind of seamless weaving of the methodology of phenomenology with your theoretical grounding. So not only the way that you brought in this kind of Hillier, which meets phenomenology, but also how you've grounded the conversation in the work of Venturi. I thought that was really interesting to see some Venturi in there, and even some Koolhaas quotes as well. So, I mean, some might think that quoting Western architects would be somewhat problematic in this conversation. But because this is a PhD grounded in architecture and architectural theory, I think it brings a relevance to it. So I really, really like the way that you've seamlessly woven the theories with the methodology in your discussion. A couple questions that I have. You quote at one time that the conversation is around a structure versus agency binary. Mm-hmm. Now, I think there are some really, really important insights throughout the PhD, but I think there's a couple of kind of theoretical hiccups that we can, or your supervisor and you can work through, just unpacking a little bit so that you give the reader a clear understanding of what you mean by these things. So let me just expand upon that. You talk about it being a structure versus agency binary, and that. And then in chapter 6, you talk about the fact that there are two actors. Now, interestingly, I would argue there are much more than two actors. The two actors that you are denoting are the refugees and the humanitarian service workers.
Mhm.
But in that conversation, there are also non-human actors, which is actually the entire point of your PhD. The architecture is one of the most important actors that in fact has one of the most important agencies within that as well. So by looking at architecture as an important actor, it kind of separates that and unpacks that binary of structure versus agency.
Mm.
I'm wondering if you gave any thought to this understanding of architecture and its agency and architecture as an actor within this kind of system.
The way I read the architecture or the built environment of the camp, and what I mean by structure versus agency binary is that architecture manifests that power relationship inside the camp space. And the power relationship, even though of course there are normal citizens and other actors in the camp, the power dynamic is between the humanitarian management and control of the camp, which basically forbids for non-temporary structures to exist. That's why there is Zinco roofs, because according to law, Zinco is impermanent material. So the architecture is the result of that power struggle. When refugees decide to build something permanent, that shows their agency. And I don't think architecture in itself is the actor, it's the manifestation of that power relationship. At least that's how I read it in the camp space.
I think that's an excellent answer. And I think somewhere in the document you should articulate that, only because it's the use of the vocabulary around actors. It starts to usher in this whole thread of actor network theory and STS studies and post-humanist studies. So anyone reading it is going to start to question why you have not included a conversation around the non-human actors, given we're talking about architecture in space.
Right.
Had you said subjects or used another word besides actor, then it may not have brought forth that conversation. But how you have articulated that in terms of how it's manifested, and that you feel and you argue that architecture is not an actor, I think requires a little bit of unpacking. And what I mean by that is just a couple of words. Now, I know that chapter 6 is a published chapter, I believe. Is it? Yes?
Yeah.
So you can maybe bring that conversation into probably the conclusion or the introduction or somewhere else that you feel it's appropriate. One of my other questions was around your use of the term social syntax. Obviously, you're looking at Hillier and this idea of space syntax. And so I'm wondering how you are defining the difference between social syntax and space syntax, whether you're conflating them or purposely using them in different ways.
Yes. So to unpack my understanding of syntax and how it's relevant to the research, understanding the space as a social product, Lefebvre's definition of social space and social production, going back and looking to the spatial syntax, and Hillier's definition of how different spaces, it combines both. So understanding how a community behaves inside the space unveils the space syntax within the dwelling in particular. And I think the example I used when in the presentation, you never enter a house through a bathroom. And it's how we use it. So the social syntax, it shapes the space syntax, and the space is a social product. So it's basically mashing up two theories in one.
Thank you, excellent. Do you think that you would call it social spatial index with a hyphen in between, or is that problematic and you want to separate the two?
Probably that could be one solution to make it more clear. Yeah.
Okay. Excellent. Excellent answer. Just one more comment, and then I can make some comments later, probably with the panel. I made comprehensive notes for you as well, which I will type up and to provide to the panel as well. And this is around the use of the term etic and emic. And of course, Verena might have, being in the anthropological ethnographic realm, have more to contribute in that regard. I know that the terms etic and emic around a conversation of phenomenology, and it's drawing from that field more so than from anthropology. I would just put in some cautionary notes around the idea of etic and emic, because contemporary anthropological studies and contemporary anthropological theory have divorced themselves from this understanding of etic and emic, in that it creates this binary where we really don't understand that where we exist when we do this kind of field research is really in the in-between.
Yeah.
The threshold between the etic and the emic. And interestingly, I love your photograph of your picture of you in the mirror in the space. That for me says everything that you need to say about etic and emic just from that image alone. But I understand you're not following an anthropological understanding of etic and emic. You're doing it more from phenomenology. But even still, I would bring in a conversation around you, that you are cognizant and you are knowledgeable about the contemporary debate around etic and emic, and you have positioned yourself in this way. Because by leaving it out like that, it will open up people who know anything about anthropology to say, oh, well, maybe there's an issue here between understanding insider outsider, because we can't be one or the other. We're constantly in this fluctuating performative space.
Yeah.
We inhabit both at the same time. So, I mean, Verena, I'm sure will have more to say on that than I will, but again, something, and these things that I'm bringing up literally only require a couple of sentences to unpack them, believe it or not, just so you can allow your reader to understand, okay, I know exactly what I'm talking about, right? For now, that's the end of my questions and comments, Verena.
Thank you so much, Janice, for providing that feedback and going in detail about, from the thesis as well. We have one more question from Nama. Nama, could I ask you to ask the question, please?
Hello, everyone. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
I would like to introduce myself. I'm a second-year PhD student at TU Delft in the Netherlands, and I'm very interested in the topic of the architecture of refugee camps. I'm currently looking at Al-Wahdat camp in Amman, Jordan, which is a Palestinian refugee camp established shortly after Jabal Hussein camp, which you have addressed and discussed in this presentation. Perhaps I have, first of all, great presentation. I really enjoyed everything you have shared with us today. But the question that I have for you is that perhaps the thing that distinguishes Palestinian refugees in Jordan is the fact that a huge portion of them holds the Jordanian passport and are legally considered Jordanian citizens, while also having the honorable identification cards and being legally considered as refugees, and viewing these identification cards as some sort of custodian of their right to return, or as a legal paper that says, okay, we are here temporarily. So what do you think this sort of ambivalence between citizen refugee has in the process of production of space and the refugee architecture that you are introducing and defining in your research?
Yeah, so in the research, which is a slight part that wasn't included in the presentation because it's a 200-word document that I have to sum up in 45 minutes. There's a historical background to the 1948 Nakba refugees and the 1967 refugees of Palestine. So there is a great document or research done by Kirsty Berg that described how it was different. It was different, and of course I'm discussing this from an architecture perspective, not a political perspective, that there was a difference in the grants and building grants and establishing self-help approach to building constructions. And evolving and taking it from the tent emergency to a settlement, a refugee settlement. However, it's still under the UN mandate, and that was my focal point of the research.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you very much, Nama, for asking the question. And I wanted to ask if Anoma or Deb had any feedback or comments.
Can I say something? Yeah.
Yes, please.
It's not questions, because if I had questions, I would have asked them long time ago, not at this stage. I'm very impressed, Dima, with your presentation and your research, because as an architect, you experience these spaces. So your architectural training comes into it, as well as your cultural background. You lived in that country, and the refugee camps have been there for 6 or 7 decades now. So they're rather permanent, they're not camps. And I never felt this emotional reading a PhD thesis. The way you started about that little girl saying she feels cold opens your eyes to the fact that you experienced it in a different way. Not just a heartless researcher going and asking questions, taking facts, but yours is pure experience. And I personally think this, in addition to being on the shelves of libraries, accessible to all the scholars, this should reach the decision makers, your findings. Isn't it? They're the ones who can make a difference. We can read it, write it, report it, source your thing, but it's a decision maker. So this is in the future. Make it into a book and make sure it goes into the United Nations. The findings should reach people who make decisions beyond our scholars. But congratulations, it's fantastic reading. It was so easy to read, in the sense, emotional, but can't stop reading that kind of thesis. Thank you.
Thank
Very
you.
proud of you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Anoma. And over to Deb.
Yeah, I want to reiterate what's been said. Excellent presentation, Dima. Excellent research. I think you've done a great job, and I know you're passionate about this. So you could definitely tell that you have that passion and expertise now in this topic. So well done. I'm very pleased with sort of what you've produced in terms of the writing and also the presentation. Just a follow-up question, actually, a little bit on Anoma's comment about implications and about kind of who the intended audience could be for your research findings. Do you see, knowing, and I know that you already talked about the implications being the people who create, officially are assigned to create a refugee space or camp, and knowing that it's temporary initially, and it's designed to be that, would you have any other recommendations other than recognizing the refugee as an important actor and understanding their agency and their needs and taking that all into consideration? Would you have any other recommendations in terms of what the refugee camp should start out as? Or is it basically that it needs to evolve and that's okay?
Well, this is, I think, my point of view, and I tried not to voice it in the research, is that I don't believe refugee camps should exist beyond the emergency state. There has to be, like looking at the bigger picture, it's resettlement effort that's going to make a difference to refugee communities. And it's a political question. It's definitely beyond an architecture analysis or geopolitical analysis. It's much bigger. So yeah, I don't think refugee camps should exist, but now that they exist, now that they are in a protracted situation, let's solve it by going back to the community itself, rather than practicing control and humanitarian power over the vulnerable victims of refugees, and just giving them the agency over their spaces.
Great, thank you. Good answer. I don't have anything further.
Okay, great. Thank you, Deb. I think we all agree it's a great presentation and it's fantastic work. And for me, I think, for me personally, my feedback, you know, in terms of given the ethical restrictions and limitations that you couldn't reference voices of people, you've done a fantastic job in representing the voice of people through the analysis and the observations that you have done. And so to me, that is really, really amazing, and that you brought that out. And we get that sense when we read the work and we hear you speak about it. And, you know, that would have been very challenging to do. But you do that with great sensitivity and understanding. And I think that's quite a strength of the work, given those limitations. So I do hope it goes far and wide, and that people will read it and get, you know, that it informs policy and understandings within the UN and other bodies. Yes, and I think further feedback will be provided afterwards. If there are no more questions, and I don't get a sense of that through the chat, we will now close this session, and where the panel will stay on to discuss, and we'll invite you back on. But I'd like to thank everyone who joined to support Dima, and I would like to thank Dima for your great research and for your great presentation, as well as your supervisors and supporters as well. Thank you everyone for joining and supporting Dima, and yeah, that was it.
Thank you, everyone.
So they're kicking us out now of the chat and then inviting us back again, or I don't know. How does it go with?
We'll ask everyone to leave now, except for people on a panel and supervisors. And then I think Deb will text you or call you and call you back onto the same link. Is that correct, Deb?
Yeah, that's how it should work.
Okay.
So Dima, you'll be the only one invited back in to hear the comment.
All right, great. Thank you.
And if you need anyone else who's your friend who wants to continue chatting with you on another channel to keep you company, but it's all good, so don't worry.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, thanks so much, everyone.
Deb, are you the host to shut off the recording?
Yeah, thanks.
Yeah.
I'm just going to run to the ladies while you're...
Me too.